All right, on this lesson, we're going to learn how to graph sine and cosine functions. Some of the things we've already learned will help when we do these problems. Now, the standard form for a sine or cosine, y equals a sine bx, or y equals a cosine bx, where remember the amplitude is the absolute value of that coefficient, which is just, if you think back a long time ago, that's just a vertical stretch or compression. And if it's negative, it's a reflection. And the period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. The period is never, ever negative. There's a pattern in these curves. The sine curve and the cosine curve both go on forever, and the pattern for sine is 0 max, 0 min, 0, and it just repeats over and over again. 0 max, 0 min, 0 max, 0 min, 0 max, 0 min, 0 max, 0 min. And the cosine pattern is max 0, min 0, max. And that just repeats over and over again. Now, where does that come from? Well, it basically comes from the unit circle. And I'm just looking at multiples of 90. 0, pi over 2, which is 90. Pi, which is 180. 3 pi over 2, which is 270. And then 2 pi, which is 360, or 4 times 90. And I'm looking at these ordered pairs. Remember, all these ordered pairs in the unit circle can be labeled cosine sine. So if you look at, just focus on the sine for a second. 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. So 0, max, 0, min, 0. And then that just continues on. For the cosine, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. So max, it's the highest value cosine can be unless there's a stretch. 1, max, 0, min, 0, max. That's where this pattern comes from. And we can use that pattern when we graph these. So here's the start is just the sine curve, where the amplitude is 1, because it's just the coefficient of the sine, the absolute value of that sine, the coefficient of that. The period, again, is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b, and the absolute value of b is 1. So that's 2 pi, which means I will finish this pattern, this last one here will be at 2 pi. But then the next thing I want to do is find the units that I'm going to put on my graph. And my units, all I do is I take the period and divide by 4. So my units on my graph, when I make my graph, I'm going to go by pi over 2. All right, now because this is a sine curve, my pattern is 0 max, 0 min, 0. Now, how do I use that? Well, here's my curve over here. What I want to do is make units of pi over 2. Now, I'm not going to use these little tiny little marks, so I'm just going to count every third. 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And this is the same graph you have on your homework. So you can do the same thing. You can go by 4s, you can go by 2s, whatever. I'm going by 3s. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to go over here in the negative direction also. And each of my units now are pi over 2, these little marks. So this is 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, 6 pi over 2. Okay, now in the other direction, negative 1 pi over 2. Negative 2 pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 2. And I know my amplitude is 1. I don't want to use these little tiny marks here on the y-axis, so I'm going to go up 3 units to represent 1. That's fine. And my pattern is 0 max, 0 min, 0. So this first one represents 0. The next one is the very first mark to the right, which is pi over 2. The next one's pi. The next one's 3 pi over 2, and so on. And they just continue on and on and on. So at 0, I'm at 0. At pi over 2, I'm at a maximum, and the maximum is my amplitude of 1. At pi, we're back at 0. At 3 pi over 2, we're at minimum. 2 pi, we're at 0. And this pattern just keeps going on and on. 0 max, 0 min, 0 max, 0 min. It keeps going on. Now, you can go backwards. You can go backwards from here. 0 min, and I'm going in the negative direction, so 0 min, we're at a minimum here. 0 min, 0 max. This is what the sine curve looks like. Okay, it is a curve. It's an infinite curve, goes on forever, never stops. So you just keep drawing this, and that's what the sine curve looks like. Right, and in a minute we'll change that up. We'll change the units and we'll change the amplitude. But let's take a look at the cosine curve. Again, the amplitude is 1. The period 2 pi over b, b is 1, so it's just 2 pi. My units are the same as the last problem. To find my units, I just divide by 4. So 2 pi over 4 is pi over 2. So each of my units is 2. But now, because this is a cosine, the pattern for cosine starts at a maximum. So max 0, min 0, max. All right, so I'm going to decide, I'm going to use the 3 marks again. Why not? You can use 4 if you want. So every 3, I'm going to put a mark here. And that will represent my units. I go in the negative direction. So my units again in this problem were pi over 2. So 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, and so on. I'm going to go all the way to the end of the graph. Just going by pi over 2 units. Right, then in the opposite direction, negative 1 pi over 2, negative 2 pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 2. And because this is a cosine curve, again, I'm just going to use 3 little marks to represent one. Cosine starts at a maximum because the cosine at 0 radians or 0 degrees is 1. So that's my maximum. Okay, so max 0, min 0, max, and that pattern just keeps going on. Max 0, min 0, max 0, min, and in the other direction I just go backwards from this. I'm already at the maximum, so then I go to 0, so just go backwards. So the cosine curve looks like this. Basically all it is the sine curve shifted. If you shifted this over, it would land right on top of that one. Okay, just shift it over. But they're very similar curves. They go on forever. They have a period of 2 pi unless there is a number in here like this one. Right? Now, just because this has negative doesn't mean the amplitude's negative, because the amplitude's always absolute value. So amplitude is 2. The period is 2 pi over the absolute value of 2, so that's just pi. My units now are going to change. I divide by 4 to find my units. Now this is a sine curve, and the pattern for sine is 0 max, 0 min, 0. But this problem has a negative, and if you think back when we did transformations, the negative in front flips or reflects across the x-axis. Well, what that does in the pattern, it changes every max to a min and every min to a max, because it's just going to reflect this. This point's going to come down here, this point's going to come up there. That's all that does. So again, I'll go by 3 marks over here. Just fill that in. Again, you can go by 4, you can go by 2. These things are so close together, I'm going to make them 3s. In my units, pi over 4. Each mark is going to be pi over 4. 1 pi over 4. 2 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4. 4 pi over 4. 5 pi over 4. 6 pi over 4. Just reduces to 3 pi over 2. Then the negatives over here. All right, and I see my amplitude is 2, so I'm going to go by every 3 marks here. That's fine. You can go by 2s if you want. All right, but now remember that negative is a reflection, so every max becomes a min, every min becomes a max. The sign always starts on the midline, but the one to the right is not at a maximum, it's at a minimum, so that one is down here. So 0 min, 0 max, 0 min, that pattern just goes on forever. So if you continue it back this way, then this next one should have been max over here, then 0, then a min. So here is the sine curve. It changes the period, because the period of a sine curve should be 2 pi, but there was a number next to that x. Remember this one was a vertical stretch or compression with a flip. This actually does a horizontal stretch or compression. It's really a horizontal compression. It's like squeezing the graph. If I had put it on here, it would have been a lot quicker, a lot more curves in there. I just stretched it out somewhere, changed the units. All right, one last one. Now a sine or a cosine. The amplitude is 3. The period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of 4. So that's pi over 2. The units, if you have it as a fraction, the easy way is just to multiply the bottom by 4. Dividing by 4 is multiplying by 1/4. So that'd be pi over 8. And my cosine pattern is max 0, min 0, max. All right, so there's a vertical stretch. I'm going to go by 2s here so it'll fit. And the units on my x are going to be pi over 8. So again, I'm going to go every 3. You can go 2, you can go 4. Now this graph, because that is a 4, you would think that's a stretch. No, it's a compression, because when it's with the x, you think opposite. It's a compression. So it's like somebody taking the graph and squeezing it together. So these units are now much smaller. 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8, 5 pi over 8, 6 pi over 8. I'm just reducing. And then, of course, the negatives over here. And there's no reflection on this one. That's a positive, no reflection. And it starts at a maximum. The maximum is that 3, because the amplitude's 3. So max 0, min 0. And that pattern just keeps going on and on and on. And if you do this correctly, the fourth one, 1, 2, 3, 4, should match your period, and it does. Over here on the other side, it's up at a maximum. It's got to come down. It's got to go through 0 first. It's an x-intercept. And then I graph this. And this would be the cosine, or 3 times the cosine of 4x. All right? That hopefully will help you get through the homework. Good luck. Have fun. Watch out for your llamas in the kitchen.